What you waiting on, Wayne? No, I appreciate good bass players. And I appreciate you too. He knows he'll never win. And I forgot to do this last Sunday because I didn't have a good look of y'all who were here. But it's especially good, and I know they were here last Sunday, to have Randall here with us this morning and Peggy. It's great news. Randall is flowing and Peggy is going. And so we're good. I better stop. It could get worse. So we've been talking for the past several weeks about a subject about sexual purity, about, if you want to get particular, sexual discipleship. Now, I know those two words don't seem to go together for us, sexual and discipleship. You probably feel a little more comfortable if I said financial discipleship. But here's the truth even about that. There are people in our Christian culture who believe they are right with God, that them and God are okay, that everything is fine between them and God, but I handle my money the way I want to handle my money. You know, that's just an area, that's just for me, that God doesn't have anything to do with that. And there are people in our Christian culture, and a lot of them, to think they're fine with God, everything's good between them and God, but they don't need to be a part of a church. They can do that on their own. They don't need other people in that. And there are people, and a lot of them, who believe they're good with God, everything's fine between them and God, but then their sex lives, they can do what they want to with that. That's not a part of my relationship with God. In fact, over 50% of young people today believe they're good with God, but they can still be involved in porn and in sex outside of marriage, and everything's okay. But what I need you to understand is that it's spiritually impossible for you to be right with God and say, I can handle his money however I want to handle his money. I don't have to do his money the way that he says to do it. I can do it the way I want to handle it. It's spiritually impossible to say, I'm good with God, my life's okay with God, but I don't have to be part of a church. They don't accept that God has given them a ministry, and that ministry is to be involved within the church walls. Every Christian should have a ministry. They don't agree with that. I can just be fine and not even go to church. And there are a lot of people in our culture who say and don't understand that it's spiritually impossible for them to say they're okay with God and to do their sexuality however they feel like doing it. It doesn't work. It's spiritually impossible for that to work. If the gospel is true, Jesus is Lord. He's Lord over every part of our lives. If the gospel is true, he is to have first place in everything, as Paul puts it. But our culture is being discipled to think things totally different. Our culture is discipling people to think two things that seem contradictory. In the way they are, our culture is discipling us to think that sex is no big deal. No big deal at all. But also, our culture is discipling us to think that sex is the deal. It's everything. For example, the world is discipling us to think of sex as just something casual. Hookup culture is just virtually normal. That as long as nobody gets pregnant, nobody gets disease, have at it. Here's another way it's taught that it seems as casual, because sex has been disconnected from childbearing and family. In other words, since the world began, sex has been identified with responsibility. It's going to produce a kid. That's responsibility. But now in the last couple of decades, abortion and birth control is taking that off the table. So it's casual because you don't have to worry about responsibility coming from that. Another way, sex has been disconnected from emotion and relationship. You can watch any sitcom and see that. So it's just something very casual. Another way, sex has been disconnected from even real life people. You're not being united with another person. You're bonding with a screen these days. So on one hand, our culture is discipling us to think that sex is no big deal. But on the other hand, our culture is discipling us to think that sex is everything. Some people's whole identity is bound up in their sexuality. And people who have non-traditional views of sexual roles, the culture will not only just tolerate that, but they'll encourage that and celebrate that. And then people who have more conservative views or who want to be somewhat modest, that's looked upon as being repressive or oppressive even. So on one hand, we're being discipled to think that sex is no big deal. On the other hand, we're being discipled to think that it's everything. Your whole identity is rooted in your sexual expression. And the way that people are being discipled into that these days is through porn. The way people are being discipled and think that sex is no big deal or sex is everything, it starts with porn. Kids at a young age exposed to porn, not just pictures, it's videos. You know how much more dopamine is released in your brain watching a video than a picture? And so these kids are from early on taught a foundation towards sexuality they're going to carry for the rest of their lives. Because you watch anybody, especially kids, that they view porn, and a neurochemical fire goes off in their brain. And it creates these neural pathways that will follow them for the rest of their lives. Listen, a 12-year-old boy shouldn't be going there. A 12-year-old boy ought to be thinking, if I jump off this roof, on this trampoline, over this car, will I break my arm? That's what he ought to be thinking. Not this. But our kids are being taught from an early age that sex is all about what you can get. They're being taught that looked at other people as objects. They're being taught that their sexual desires are not something that needs to be controlled, it's something that needs to be satisfied, no matter what the cost. And then when they get on into high school and college, they're taught as soon as you get into a relationship, have sex as soon as possible. First date's fine. And then because of that, they think that they have more feelings and stronger feelings toward the other person than they actually do. And then when they break up, it's painful. It's like a divorce. You watch kids break up these days, and it's like a divorce has happened because they come united, and now that's gone. And kids, young people, whenever they break up, it's like a divorce. I remember breaking up with a lot of girls. It wasn't like a divorce. It was like, okay, see you later. It's, next week. It wasn't a big deal. But you watch today, it is a big deal. Don't laugh at my past. It wasn't. Okay, I could go out with 2 or 3 different girls in a week. Didn't bother me any. And be gone there. I probably shouldn't say that, but anyway, all right, stop. All right. But when I found this one, there was no more other ones involved. So what they do, what they're taught when they have that breakup, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the pain of that? Well, you go and you get attached to somebody else. And so you get attached and detached, attached and detached, and attached and detached. And so after a while, there's nothing holy, nothing sacred about that at all. And then they get married. And they bring that into marriage. And they think, sex, it's for me, it's for what I can get, and they bring that attitude into marriage. And I know you get tired of me using this analogy, but there's really no better analogy. They become like two ticks and no dogs. They suck the life out of each other. And that type of relationship, that lasts on an average about 18 months. And what began as, oh, I've got to have you, you're my one and only. After about 18 months, that's gone. Does that sound about right? Good description where our culture's at? They may continue to live together for a while, but they don't know nothing about knowing how to love. So the question is, how do we, as a Christian culture, experience a life free from porn, free from sex outside of marriage? How do we begin to experience it as God intended us to experience that? Now, what the church has typically done in this is talked about behavior. They made it all about your behavior. Stop doing that. Don't do that. But that approach does not work. Never has, never will. It will work for a short time, okay? But all you're doing is you're talking about the fruit. You're not talking about the root when you talk about behavior. The goal is not to get people to stop looking at porn. The goal is not to get people to stop having sex outside of marriage. The goal is to make them disciples. Go and make disciples, teach them to observe everything I have commanded you. The goal is to teach them to bring every part of their life under the control and the lordship of Christ. That is the goal. So how do we get there? I'm going to give you two things, and I struggle with this. I don't want to call them two foundations or two principles. I'm not sure what to call them, but I'm going to give you two mindsets. Maybe that's a better word, that it has to be there for people to experience freedom long term. We're going to talk about one this week. We're going to talk about the other one next week. Okay, and then we're just going to talk about healing from a sexual past on the third week from today, and then we'll be done with this series. So, we have to understand that if we're going to be free from this, the issue is not behavior, the issue is beliefs. See, we want to make it all about behavior, but really, what the core issue is beliefs. What do you believe? That has to be the core issue. Do you believe that in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth? Do you believe that? Or do you believe that in the beginning there was just this big accident? See, as Christians, we believe that God created everything and that He has a purpose for everything. I mean, we'll look at it and we'll say there's even scientific evidence of that. Look at the human eye, how complex it is. That couldn't have just happened. And look at where the earth is at and how it's tilted on the axis and how it rotates and how far away it is from the sun. That had to be just right to support life. And that's true. And as scientists discover more and more about the complexity of our universe and the complexity of the human body, they're saying, look, we're not saying something for God, but this couldn't have just happened. There had to be a designer behind this. And it doesn't take the complexity of the human eye to understand that. Hear this, understand that. Don't be absurd. Nobody made us. We evolved by chance from snowflakes. Listen, you can even watch the snow fall and realize that. Okay? You don't have to be a neuroscientist to realize that. So, what do you believe? Because if you believe that God created the heavens and the earth with all its intricacy, with all its minuteness and how complex it was, then you have to believe that God created you as a sexual being with the design in mind. That didn't just happen. You can't tell me you believe God created the heaven and the earth and that He didn't design your sexuality with a purpose and a plan. So it comes back to what you believe. And that makes sexual discipleship sound kind of normal, right? Puts it into a different perspective. Because we're talking about how God created everything. It goes back to what we believe about God. So here we read this in Genesis 2:24. This is why a man leaves his father and mother and bonds with his wife, and they become one flesh. What I want you to see in this verse is that before there was sin in the world, there was sex. It was God's purpose to unite a man and a woman, not just physically, but also spiritually on a very deep level. So in Song of Solomon, the whole book's about the physical relationship between a husband and a wife. In chapter 5, the husband and wife, they come together and they've made love together, and they're sitting there cuddling each other. And then in verse 1 of chapter 5, after that takes place, you have one of the only times, I know scholars disagree on this, one or two times where God speaks in the whole book. So after they've come together and they've made love and they're cuddling together, God looks down upon that, and here's what God says. What was that? No, he doesn't say that. He says this. Read it for you. He says, eat, O friends, and drink your fill. Be intoxicated with caresses. Why? Because he's celebrating this. It's a gift. And he's given us to enjoy, and they've enjoyed it. Be intoxicated with your caresses with one another. God created your sexuality with a design, not just whatever your desires may be, with a purpose, not just to follow any passion. And he's laid that out for us. In fact, we read this in Genesis 1. So God created man in his own image, so he created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. Now, this is not a series about genderism or anything like that, but there are people today, a lot of them, who believe that really they are a different gender than how they were created to be, or they'll put it than what was assigned to them at birth. And they struggle with that. They struggle with that. And the whole thing sounds kind of silly. You're talking about different gender, what you were assigned at birth, as if some doctor went down the hallway, just said boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, and just assigning people that? No. God created that in the womb. But here's the thing. We need to understand that that's a real struggle for people. And I hope that with love and compassion, we can talk to them and that we will gently lead them back to Genesis 1. No, you were created male or female. Because see, here's what we need to understand. The further away we get from how God designed us and created it, the further away we can get from that, the more it looks like he knew what he was doing. Because the further away you get from that, the more pain, the more confusion, the more hurt that's caused. And the more our culture will look at things and go, I think God knew what he was talking about. When he said it's for design, for this purpose, and it's supposed to be in a marriage relationship. We read this in 1 Corinthians 6:18. We talked about this when we started this series. Flee sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the person who is sexually immoral sins against his own body. In other words, you get away from God's design, you hurt yourself. It causes pain. And here's the ironic thing. Our culture over the years, over the past 50 or so years, done all these little questionnaires and surveys and all this stuff and done some deep research into this and discovered, they don't put it this way, but they discovered, God's way really does work. Here's one example. Wall Street Journal had this as a headline in one of their articles. Too risky to wed in your 20s? Not if you avoid cohabiting first. And what the article is about women who instead of waiting later on in life to get married, they get married in their 20s, but when they get married, they didn't live with the guy first. That has decreased a lot their propensity to get divorced. So in other words, where our culture is pushing us is to have a test drive. You want to get married? How do you know it's going to work? Live together. Make it a test drive. You wouldn't drive a car without test driving it first. You need to test drive and make sure this is going to work. And what culture has been, and this is, hundreds of studies. This is just one example. But these studies have been going on for years because we've seen this happen in our culture for years. And so for years, the stats show the test drives don't work. In fact, that increases by 50%. So instead of having 50% chance of divorce, all right, I'm trying to slow down, Becky. I'm trying. Giving it my best. So rather than decrease your chance of divorce, it increases it now 75%. Because you're choosing to not do things God's way and to have sex outside of marriage. You want it to work? God's way makes it work. So, in Scripture, God gives us all these warnings around sexuality. Things that should be clear and apparent to us. We read one of these a couple of weeks ago in this series. This one right here. God's given us some warnings. For this is God's will, your sanctification, that you keep away from sexual immorality, that each of you knows how to control his own body in holiness and honor, not with lustful passions like the Gentiles who don't know God. This means one must not transgress against and take advantage of a brother or sister in this manner, because the Lord is an avenger of all these offenses. And we also previously told you and warned you. For God has not called us to impurity, but to live in holiness. Consequently, anyone who rejects this does not reject man, but God who gives you his Holy Spirit. Paul's saying, look, we warned you about this. You ever buy those things that have warnings on them that you think, you got to tell me that? That's pretty self-apparent, is it not? Lisa bought a new hairdryer 2 weeks ago. And in the instructions is the warning, do not use in the bathtub. Why, thank you for that. I'm so glad you told me that. And I'm kind of past the stage of hairdryers for myself anyway. But just in case I got the inclination I'm going to get in the bathtub and blow dry my scalp, you tell me that's not a good idea. Same thing with an iron. They'll have the warning, do not iron clothes while on your body. Oh. No, it's there. I've read it. And I understand, well, maybe it's a lot quicker if I just, instead of taking the shirt off, put it on the iron plate, if I just iron it while it's on my body. But I'm thinking, no, if ever I'm inclined to iron the clothes on my body, putting that hot iron up against that, maybe that's not a good idea. I think that's pretty self-apparent. A couple months ago, I brought a pole saw. It's a 8-foot pole with a chainsaw on the end of it. And it has on there these stickers around chainsaws. So I'll say, your hand, keep your hand away or whatever. Basically, do not stop the chain with your hand. Well, thank you for that. In case I was ever considering that, now I know not to do that. To heed these warnings, if you're going to heed the warnings, it all goes back to what you believe. Do you really believe that getting in the bathtub with a hairdryer is not a good idea? Do you really believe that? Do you really believe that if you try to stop a chainsaw with your hands, it's not going to be good for you? It all goes back to what you believe. And if we're going to be a people that walk in purity, the discussion shouldn't be around behavior. It should start with our beliefs. Do you believe that God created you and designed you in a certain way? And if you go by his design, his creation, it will go well with you. And if you choose to use something in a way it was designed to be used, it's not going to be good for you. Do you believe that? There's a guy named Becket Cook. He was a production designer in Hollywood, very successful, and lived for 30 years as a gay man. I want to read you his testimony. And as I do, I will try to emphasize, but I want you to hear how his views now is not coming from a behavior, it's based on a belief. Okay? So here's what he said. He said, I had many boyfriends over the years, attended pride parades, and marched in innumerable rallies for gay marriage equality. My identity as a gay man was immutable, or so I thought. But in 2009, I encountered Jesus when I attended a church in Hollywood for the first time. And here's what he said happened. I walked into that church as a gay atheist. I walked out 2 hours later as a born-again Christian in love with Jesus. I was stunned by the reversal. Since then, I no longer identify as gay, but rather choose to be celibate because I believe God's plan and purpose revealed in the Bible is authoritative, true, and good. This is what I believe. Surrendering my sexuality hasn't been easy. I still struggle with the vestiges of same-sex attraction, but denying myself, taking up my cross, and following Jesus is an honor. Any struggles I experience pale in comparison to the joy of a personal relationship with the one who created me and gives my life meaning. My identity is no longer in my sexuality, it's in Jesus. So instead of celebrating this authenticity, this new life that he was experiencing and the greatness of it, his friends shunned him, began to criticize him. He was fired from his job. And this is what he says. As a result of that, he says, I'm not complaining about any of that or claiming to be a victim, because what I gained in Christ is absolutely priceless. Like the Apostle Paul, I'm learning to count everything as lost because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. Yes, the loss of close friendships and a lucrative career were harsh, but being in the kingdom of God more than compensates. And then a personal friend to him, criticized him for not being authentic to who he was. And this was his reply. I am the most authentic person you know. In fact, because I'm now who God created me to be, you see that? Who created me to be, I'm finally being authentic. Becoming more and more like Jesus, the truest human who ever lived, is far more authentic transformation than becoming more and more like whatever self my fluid feelings suggest at any given day. He repeats, he says, I believe what God says is authoritative, true, and good. Taking up my cross and following Jesus is an honor. Don't tell me I'm getting the short end of the deal on this. Don't make it sound like this is too much to ask by giving up these things or sacrificing and surrendering myself in this way, that I'm somehow missing out compared to the joy, surpassing joy of knowing Jesus Christ my Lord. There is no victim in that. It more than compensates. And then he says this, listen closely. This is worth it all right here. People don't understand how much more amazing it is to deny yourself and follow Christ rather than to give into sin now just to satisfy an immediate need. Let me repeat that for you. People don't understand how much more amazing it is to deny yourself and follow Christ rather than to give into sin now just to satisfy an immediate need. With God, I feel this unconditional love from him that will never leave. I am happy to leave that dead man behind because he's worth it. See, we think this is a sermon series about behavior. No, it's a sermon series based on a belief. He said in there several times, I believe that what God says is authoritative, true, and good. Do you believe that? That's the question. Or do you believe, like so many in our culture, that trying to do things God's way, that's oppressive and repressive, that you're not experiencing all the things life has to offer? Well, it's sort of like you're driving along the mountains and they have a guardrail there on the side of the mountain because there's a drop-off. You know, I lived in Colorado for 5 years, drove through a lot of mountains. And I didn't never feel like those guardrails inhibited me from living life. I thought they're there for my protection. They give me freedom to be able to drive rather than worrying about, am I going to get too close and fall off? Oh, as the car comes, 2-lane highway, and I'm right there close. At least I was, look at, I just expect, that's going to happen because we're going to fall. No, there's a guardrail there. So when God gives us warnings, it's not to keep us from experiencing good things. It's a guardrail for our protection and for us to be able to live life to the fullest. God has designed for marriage. He has designed for sex. And there's a guy, Tim Keller, y'all might be familiar with the name. He describes God's design. He does such a good job of describing this. This is real short. But this is what he says. Sex is a way of saying, I'm giving myself to someone fully, exclusively, and permanently. Fully, because it's meant to involve the whole of who we are. Our entire person is given to this other person. Exclusively, because if I'm giving myself in totality to that person, I'm not giving myself in the same way to anyone else. And permanently, because this bond is designed to create this bond, because the bond this is designed to create is not meant to be undone and cannot be undone without considerable pain. Giving yourself to someone fully, exclusively, and permanently. See, this is going to involve a change in the way that we think. And we're familiar with this verse in Romans. Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you may discern what the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God is. What he's saying is don't let the world disciple you into thinking about sex like this, because God has given us you as a gift, and he's given us you something that's going to be good, inherently good in it. Something that's going to fulfill you, to perfect you, to, as we would say in our culture today, that's going to complete you. Why would you want to turn your back on that? But that is where our culture is discipling us to go. And we need to be discipled, not in the way the culture is going, the world is going, but into what God says. Do we believe in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and all that is in it, and that created us with such complexity, with such intricacy, that even our sexual lives, even our sexuality, he designed that for a purpose? Do we believe that or not? That's where it falls down to. So, to tell you to stay away from porn or any sex outside of marriage, from God's perspective, that's sort of like telling you, don't grab the chain on the chainsaw and try and stop it from moving. It's going to hurt. It's not going to be good. The question is, do you believe that? Do you believe that what he says is authoritative, true, and good? Now, as we move into a time of invitation, you may be saying, not my issue. I'm good there. Okay, fine. I'm glad. But what you needed to hear is what I said at the beginning, is that if the gospel is true, Jesus is Lord, and he should be Lord over every part of our lives. And there may be a part of your life that he's not in control over right now. It may not be your sexuality. It could be your money. It could be your church life. I mean, this next Sunday, we're going to have a ministry fair. And so you get to see some of the ministries that's going on inside of our church, to get involved. Because if you're a Christian and you don't have a ministry, you're not using your gift, don't tell me you're okay with God. Don't tell me everything is fine. That's spiritually impossible. And if you want to have that discussion more, I'll be glad to have that discussion more with you and talk. We've been over that before in other Bible studies and things. So, if the gospel is true and Jesus is Lord, he's Lord over every part of your life, is that what you can say this morning? Is he in control of your sexuality? Are you living by what he says? Is that what you, and to quote Becket Cook, is that what you believe? He says it over and over. Now I believe. This is not a discussion about behavior. It's a discussion about what do you really believe? So, what do you believe? And some of you this morning may need to take this opportunity to say, yes, I've been letting myself be discipled and conform to the world, but instead, I'm going to build my life now based on what God says. I believe what he says is true, or is true and good. So, I'm going to ask the guys to come forward. We're going to have a time of invitation. And as we do, this is your chance. You know what Becket Cook says? I walked into that church, a gay atheist, walked out 2 hours later as a committed follower of Christ. So what it's saying is that, look, there's a point where you have to make a decision. He made a decision that day that he was going to be a Christ follower. And you can come and you can make that decision today yourself. That I'm going to be a Christ follower. He's going to be Lord over every part of my life. It's all going to be under his control. Are you ready to do that? Let's stand together. If you have a decision to make, you may want to come and kneel and pray. You may want to come and share with me that decision. I'll pray